Hi, this is Zach from Mercury Works, and I'm going to show you how to use your Stereo 12 camera. I'm going to go through all the basic functions and get you started up and running and shooting. The Stereo 12 is unlike any other medium format stereo camera of the past. All of those are either very old with outdated lens technology, worn out mechanisms, etc., or they were poorly made to begin with, like the 1960s Sputnik Soviet camera, or they are incredibly large, bulky, delicate, poorly made, etc. The main thing that differentiates the Stereo 12, though, from all previous medium format stereo cameras is its modular system. It can take a huge number of different types of lenses, so you can change lenses anytime you want, just like any other modern camera. Crazily, earlier medium format stereo cameras only generally had fixed lenses, and that was for mechanical reasons, limitations of the engineering. But obviously having multiple focal lengths is an important part of modern photography, and the Stereo 12 allows you to do that in stereo. Secondly, the Stereo 12 takes a huge number of different types of film backs. So not only can you shoot different formats, but you can change between different types of film at any moment. So let's take a look at the camera. The front of the camera basically accepts a lens board. A lens board is this board that holds both of your shutters and both of your lenses, and it includes the electronic triggering mechanism. These are called electronic lens boards. They're also manual lens boards, but for the Stereo 12, electronic lens boards are the usual thing you would use. And many different types are possible. So we have for instance, this is Fujinon large format lenses. The camera can also take, this is an example of a lens board that takes the very inexpensive Mamiya TLR lenses. These come with 2 per pair in the original Mamiya TLR system, and thus they're very economical. So that's that. There are also any lenses that take Copal 0 shutters. There's a lens board for that. So the lens board is specific to the shutter type, not necessarily the exact lens. Different lenses come in different shutters, but the lens board needs to be matched to the shutter type. So for instance, the Mamiya TLR, Copal 0, this is a generic 0 board that takes many other brands of lenses that use the 0 size, like Comper, Seiko, etc. So the front of the camera looks like this without the lens board. And basically what you do is you add spacers and then the lens board on top of that. So the spacers are generally, it's different for different lenses, but generally there's a base spacer that snaps in the front. Then there's a focus spacer, and in the next section of the video I'll explain how to use focus spacers, but basically your focus spacer then goes on top of that, and then your lens board just fits right on top of the spacers. All of them are attached with these thumb screws. The thumb screws are color-coded, so the head of the screw matches a particular configuration of the camera, and I'll explain that later, but basically you will know which color to use. You don't have to figure out different bolts. You just know which color to put on, and it just screws in very quickly. And when you do attach these lens boards, you want to screw it in so that it is just barely finger tight. You do not want to tighten it down, because if you do that, it can cause the lens board to flex, and you can get out of alignment. So it's important that you don't over tighten, and there's no need at all. The purpose of the screw is just to hold it in place. And once you put all 4 screws in, your lens board is good. I will mention that of a set of 4 thumb screws, generally you have one that has this longer head. and the longer knurl on it. That longer one is meant to go down in the lower right corner here, because usually, this is not true for all lens boards, but it's true for most lens boards, there is an actuator here, actuator housing with a solenoid in it, and it sticks up, and because it sticks up, you have a longer head on your thumb screw. The screw is the same length, but because it has this longer head, it's much easier to screw in and out without any trouble, because without this housing getting in the way, right? So this one sticks up a little bit higher, but technically any bolt can work in any of the 4 positions. On the back side of the camera is what's called a Graflock 4.5 mounting system. Now this enables the camera to mount any number of film backs, and this is based on the Graflock 4.5 standard, which is the standard for large format 4x5 cameras internationally, which means that many backs that are commercially available for different large format cameras work on the Stereo 12. For example, 120 backs work. They need to be not only 4x5 format, Graflock 4.5 format, but they also need to be panoramic format, because you have to have a wide enough back to work. So you can't use 6x9 backs, etc. It has to be a 6x12 roll film back, such as the Horseman 6 exposure back, and that will mount right on the camera. There's also the Dai back, which is a Chinese-made back for roll film. There's a very, very fancy Techno Rolex made by Linhof, and very expensive, very fancy back, especially wide frame. But there's also the Mercury Superback, officially the 65-70 millimeter panoramic back. This is a machined, rebuilt, redesigned back using an old vintage 70 millimeter back, but that's been completely inside and out remachined and rebuilt to become a panoramic back. The original was meant for portraits. This is a panoramic back, so it has the long frame and has been redesigned to work with 65 millimeter and 70 millimeter film. So this long roll film gives you an enormous number of exposures. Instead of 6 per roll, you can get up to 32 or 35 panoramic stereo images on one roll. So this is highly, highly recommended. All of these backs just fit in place, and then you slide these these are called Graflock sliders. You just slide these toward the left, and they lock the back in place. Those sliders are tensioned with a screwdriver. You can use any small Phillips head screwdriver to adjust these screws in order to make it as tight or loose as you like. And generally, you want these to be tight, but still easy to lock and unlock your back. But you don't want them loose, because you don't want your back to accidentally detach. It'd have to be very loose for that, but you also don't want any play in the back. So make sure that these have been tightened to your satisfaction. If it feels too tight, it's hard to lock and unlock these, then you can loosen them up a little bit, or you can just work them a little and they tend to get a little smoother. But those are the Graflock sliders that hold the back in place. So to detach the back, obviously you just push them to the right and remove the back. Other common backs that the Stereo 12 can take include these special cut film holders. So these are modified 4x5 sheet film holders that Mercury has modified to hold strips of 65 millimeter IMAX motion picture film or 70 millimeter film. There's a 65 and a 70 millimeter version. These hold 2 shots per back, 1 on each side. They are extremely thin and light, and so you can easily take extra film with you, maybe film that you use less commonly, or different types of film, so that you have multiple types on you, but they take up very little space. They're also very inexpensive compared to roll film backs, so it's a good way to have multiple backs for, without carrying a huge amount of weight or spending an enormous amount of money. These have been machined in their original form. They can be connected to the camera with rubber bands that attach from the top of the front of the cold shoe to this little screw in the back. However, the Mercury version has has been machined to Graflock standards. So it actually mounts without any rubber bands or anything like that. It mounts with the regular Graflock sliders like that. Finally, maybe the fanciest of the cut film backs is the Grafmatic. The Grafmatic mounts just like anything else. It holds 6 frames. It's also extremely thin, very low profile, great for travel or slimming down the camera, and it holds 6 shots, the same number as a 120 roll film back. You can watch my separate videos about how to use the 65mm, 70mm panoramic back and the Grafmatic back and the cut film backs. But now with the film backs removed, let's take a quick look at other features of the back of the camera. Over here, you'll notice a fuse. Now, because the electronic system, the triggering system of the Stereo 12 uses quite high amperage, for a very brief moment, it discharges a high amperage into the lens board in order to very, very quickly actuate both lenses simultaneously. Because of that, there's protective circuitry built into this, and the user accessible one of which is this fuse. If you short out if something goes terribly wrong, you connect it wrong, you short out your system, the fuse will blow to protect the camera and the lens board. And you can always just look at it. We make accessible here, so when the back's off, you can see right in there and see if the fuse has been blown or not. And if so, of course, you can replace it, but that would be a very, very rare event that you would ever blow a fuse. I've never seen it happen, but that's the fuse. The other thing that's here is your battery compartment. Now, this takes 2 9-volt, standard 9-volt batteries, and before you can use your camera at all, you will have to open it up to replace those, to put batteries in. To do that, you use a small Phillips head screwdriver. You should have one of these in your kit. That's recommended in the user guide. And all you do is loosen these screws, and then you can just pop this out. And inside, you'll notice 2 little 9-volt holders. They have little shaved corner on the side. The shaved corner fits here against this boss in the corner. So that should be pretty obvious how it fits once you have the battery in there. Once you have the battery in there, it's a pretty tight, relatively tight fit. But you just connect the 2 batteries with the right polarity. Be careful, of course, and tuck them in there, and pop this back on. Technically, you can operate the camera like this without replacing those screws because it does snap in place, the battery cover. But unless you're just temporarily testing something out, have really bad batteries, etc., it's a good idea to go ahead and keep those screws in there because the batteries can actually get heavy and they can actually pop this off. Not when there's a film back on the camera, but if you don't have a film back on, it can be a problem. Okay, on the left edge of your camera, you'll notice a number of ports. First off is the Lensboard port. This is what you connect your Lensboard electrical cable to. And this is a standard 3.5mm stereo cable, so you could replace it with a larger one if you needed it or whatever, but this is the cable that comes with it. You just plug that into the Lensboard side, and then you plug it into your Lensboard. Lensboards, sometimes they have a port in a different place, but usually the connection port is right here at the bottom of the Lensboard, and you just plug the cable right into the Lensboard. Next up after that is the side handle connection port. Now these are metal threads, quarter 20 threads in here, and they conform to the small rig side handle standard. These are generally handles that are made for video camera cages and rigs of various kinds. So in the user guide, we mentioned a couple of recommended side handles that have different characteristics, some smaller, some larger. And these actually just screw right into the side of the camera. We'll talk about that more when we talk about handheld shooting. Next up is the side cold shoe. This is where you can mount various accessories, either electronics accessories or wireless trigger or a side rangefinder, etc. And then finally is the remote socket. This is for remote triggers, external triggers, and that can include pretty much any standard trigger that uses a 2.5 millimeter connector, or it can be a wireless trigger. So you put the receiver here, plug it into that port, and you can wirelessly shoot your camera. Or it can be the Stereo 12 Deluxe trigger. That's this trigger here. It has a very short cable and is engineered specifically for the camera. So it just plugs in there and it actually mounts up here until you're ready to shoot, and then you just pop it off and you can trigger your camera here as opposed to the normal trigger, which is here. If you're hand holding, etc., you can always trigger it on board the camera, but you can also trigger it with anything plugged into the remote socket. Finally, at the top, there's a little circular hole that goes through the top of each side of the camera, and that's for attaching quick release straps for neck straps, which again, I'll cover when we talk about handheld shooting. On the top of the camera, you have an on-off switch. You want to keep this camera turned off to prevent the drain on your batteries when you're not using it for an extended period of time, but they do drain very slowly, so you can keep it on for long periods while you're actually shooting. You just switch that to on when you are ready to shoot. The other thing that's on top here are just 3 cold shoes. The central one is for viewfinders, the other 2 are for accessories. And if you can see this little symbol, this is the film plane symbol. If you are ever measuring with a laser finder or a measuring tape or anything like that for some very precise measurement, maybe for very close-up photography or something, that symbol shows you exactly where to measure from when measuring distances. That's the exact point of where the film lands. The Stereo 12 uses zone focusing. And what this means is, instead of focusing continuously on a subject, you create a focal zone of a range in which you want everything to appear in focus. And you do that by changing the focus spacer. So, as I mentioned before, most lenses require a base spacer, and that never changes for a given lens. And then a focus spacer, and the focus spacer is what you change if you want to change your focal zone. Now, to understand this, we have to talk a little bit about the theory behind stereography. And this is different than flat photography, where you're shooting in just 2 dimensions. In flat photography, you often want to isolate your subject from the background and foreground in order to emphasize them. In stereo photography, on the other hand, you don't focus on a particular subject, and you certainly don't want to isolate them because that removes all stereo depth from the image. Instead, stereo photography is about capturing the relationship between multiple subjects. And to do that, you need to generally increase your depth of field as much as possible. That usually means shooting with the smallest aperture possible. I prefer f/22 in most cases. Some people prefer f/16. Sometimes you might want to go to f/32, etc. You really want to maximize your depth of field, because the greater your zone of focus is, the more objects will be rendered in relationship to each other in depth. And that's the point of a 3D photograph, is to capture depth, to capture relationships of space within the image. In order to do that, there are a couple of different strategies that stereo photographers use. The first is hyperfocal. Now, the way that the hyperfocal technique works is you want to basically get infinity in focus. And when infinity is in focus, you want to then stretch back to also have the closest possible subject in focus. What hyperfocal is, a hyperfocal at a particular f-stop, it's a spacer, the spacer that gives you infinity as close to the camera as possible while still including infinity. For any given lens and any given f-stop, that might be a different spacer. But because most photographers use f16 and don't open more than that for stereo photography, or f22, that narrows the range of possible focal zones that actually include infinity. You can look this up on the Mercury lens info spreadsheet. You can look up your lens and see which different spacers at given f-stops, and the f-stops listed here are f22, f16, and then it skips down to f8. Once you've found that, if you're the type of person who prefers hyperfocal, you want your infinity to always be in focus, and you just want to maximize what you get from there in terms of close focus, then usually that's one, and you know what f-stop you want to shoot at, that's it. Once you have one spacer, that spacer will never change, except maybe in very special circumstances where it's, you know, nighttime and you have to open up to a narrower stop or something. But in general, hyperfocal shooting requires one spacer, and you never have to think about it again. When you compose your subject, you're looking for a subject that falls within the hyperfocal range. So for instance, on this particular spacer and lens, at f22, this is our hyperfocal spacer. And this particular spacer will make everything from infinity to 7 feet. So 7 feet to infinity is all in focus. So as long as whatever you shoot is not closer than 7 feet, you can always shoot with this without needing to do any focal adjustment at all. Very, very fast and easy to use. Not everyone wants to use hyperfocal, and the reason is this. Stereo photography generally doesn't capture any depth at infinity. Objects that are far away don't render much depth, just as with the human eye, because it depends on the distance between the eyes or the distance between the lenses, which is the same in the case of the Stereo 12. We can't perceive depth at great distances because our eyes are not far enough apart to mark a difference to those subjects, right? So the closer the subject, the more we perceive depth, and it's the same in stereo photography. So if infinity objects don't give you any depth, maybe that's not what you want your images to focus on. So the second technique is the 3D sweet spot. And this technique, instead of getting as close as you can while still holding infinity in focus, the technique here is to match your focal zone to the sweet spot of depth perception. To do this, you want to think about which range of distances will render your subjects with the maximum, or at least a perceptible and interesting amount of 3D depth. And generally, the very, very rough guideline here is that your best stereo depth, when you're shooting with the Stereo 12, which matches the human physiology in terms of interpupillary distance, the most interesting depth is going to be between 6 feet and 12 feet. Closer than 6 feet, it begins to be difficult for the human eye, and when viewing later, to fuse properly and what looks right to us. And greater than 12 feet away rapidly diminishes the amount of depth. You know, you still do see depth beyond 12 feet at 15, 20 feet, even 25 feet, etc., but it will not be very pronounced depth. which is to say that if you are trying to capture depth, i.e. spatial relationships in your imagery, ideally you don't want your subject to really be farther away than 12 feet. Since that's the case, you might want to shift your focal zone to maximize that sweet spot, which is to say you want to capture at least 6 feet away and at least to 12 feet, ideally. And then more than that is a bonus. So you might want to say, well, it'd be great to go out to 20 feet. Now remember, this is just that your focal zone is your area of sharp focus. Beyond that, things are still perceptible and will still actually to the eye appear quite sharp. To find the 3D sweet spot, you once again can look at either the Mercury Stereo Toolkit app, or you can look at the lens spreadsheet and look through these tables and look at the different ranges. So for a given lens and given set of f-stops, what's the focal zone? You might want to find something that maximizes the type of subjects at the distances that you want to shoot. And again, hyperfocal is a little easier here. So if you choose hyperfocal, you pretty much know what you want, and you just need to be careful that you don't shoot something that's too close to the camera. Here you need to kind of know something about your style, what you're trying to capture, and the sorts of spatial relationships and the types of depth, the amount of depth that you want in your 3D images, etc. And then you can choose a range. So for instance, for a 65mm Mamiya TLR lens, we might, the hyperfocal for f/22 would be spacer number 2, but you might say, oh, actually, spacer number 3 here yields a range of 5.5 feet to 35 feet at f/22. That sounds really good. Everything that I want that is important in my image is going to be within that range. Or at f/16, which I might shoot at sometimes, everything from 6.5 feet to 20 feet is going to be sharp. That sounds pretty good too. You might find that for a 65mm lens, this particular one, that a number 3 focal zone is perfect for almost everything you're likely to shoot. You don't care if the very, very far distance is super, super sharp. It will still be probably pretty sharp in your image here because your focal zone is extending out to 20 or 35 feet. Things beyond that will not be as razor sharp, but they aren't going to be completely out of focus either. That's why there are a lot of spacers available. There are 14 possible spacers. Any given lens might only use a subset of those. You can always choose any spacer you want in here. And these models are all available. You can 3D print them, have them 3D printed, order them from Mercury Works. You can have as many spacers around as you want to achieve any focal zone you want. If you like either of these techniques, you can generally get away with one spacer only and never have to change. And that also means you can shoot very, very fast because you're never out of focus, as you are with a traditional helical focal unit. And one final trick when it comes to focus zones and subject distances is this. If you find that you want to shoot a subject that's closer to the camera than 6 feet, you can actually do that as long as you limit the farthest subject in your frame. So instead of being able to see to infinity, for instance, if you shoot indoors or you shoot against a wall or you shoot against a building or anything else that obscures far away subjects, that basically gives you closer subjects than 6 feet become okay. So you can calculate the range of possible subjects if you limit your far points using our Stereo Toolkit app. But you can also look at our focal zones themselves in the spreadsheet or on your focus spacers. And basically, if a focal zone includes a close subject distance, a close distance in focus that is, closer than 6 feet, look at the far distance that is in sharp focus. And if you were to actually limit, it's not just about focus, if you were to limit your far point so that the camera sees nothing farther away than that point, whether it's in focus or not, that is a legal range. And by restricting your far away subjects, you've gained now the ability to shoot closer subjects, and your image will still be legally viewable. So you can use this to your advantage in certain circumstances. Also, you might have special subjects. There might be times when you do want to drastically reduce your f-stop and shoot at a narrower depth of field because you're forced to, or you want to for artistic reasons. Again, that will drastically reduce your stereo depth in your image, but there might be a trade-off there that you want, and in that case, you may need to use a special spacer to narrow your zone of focus and nail exactly the distance you need. Each spacer actually does have a focal distance, and that's this number in this column. And that focal distance is technically the center of your focal area. And that might be useful if you are shooting at very narrow depth of field, i.e. a large aperture, and are using, for instance, maybe a rangefinder, which you can pop onto the camera to nail focus at those short ranges in those narrow ranges. That's also available as a technique.
So here's an example. Let's say we are shooting and we realize that we want to change from focal spacer 3 to spacer number 4. So first we need to loosen all 4 bolts. And then we're just going to lift the lens board up and away from the front of the camera, and you don't even have to disconnect the cable and pull off your focus spacer, change it out for another one, pop the lens board back on the camera, tighten down all 4 screws again. That's it. That's all it takes to change a focus spacer in the field. So it's fast and easy to do. But once again, most of the time you only need one focus spacer for most of the things you'll shoot.
How do you get these labels on your spacer, and what does it mean? At the far left is the number, so the number of the spacer, and that is also physically printed into the spacer itself. So that's physically part of it on the 2 sides. On the left and right, it has the number of the focal spacer. If it's a base spacer, it says base and then the number of the base. Focal spacer just has a number, and that number corresponds to this number. This is the lens, 65 millimeter. This is the base spacer that you're supposed to use with this focal spacer, just as a reminder that you've got it set up properly. And then this is this is color coded, and it tells you which kind of what colored bolt to use on the front. In this case, it's gray, and if it has a W, that means that you should add a washer to the front of the bolt. Sometimes it's split, like this one has a gray and a gray with a W. That means basically that you can use a gray, or you could use gray with a washer. Either one will fit in this for this particular combination of boards. Right? It's a shortcut to just tell you which color bolt to put on, but usually for a given lens, it's always going to be the same. In this case, most TLR lenses use just gray. The 55 millimeter uses black. But anyway, then the next number there is your exact focal distance. Again, like I said, that only matters if you're shooting at very narrow aperture, very narrow depth of field, and using a rangefinder on the side of the camera, and you're dialing in a number. Basically, you would dial in this number, and then that would tell you when you're the exact proper in focus for your particular subject. But normally that doesn't matter. What really matters far more is the range here, right? And at f22, your focal range is 5.5 feet to 35 feet. The next one is f16, which is 6.5 feet to 20 feet. And the next one is f8. And I do f8 instead of f11 just so that you can get a sense of, oh, if I do cut it down to a much smaller aperture, this will be the range. But you could change this out and change it to f11. You can do whatever you want, because you, in your own local copy of this spreadsheet, can go in and edit this information however you want. So that's the cheat sheet. And basically what you do is you go to the spreadsheet, and in the spreadsheet there's both a full focal information, and then there's another sheet that is formatted for printing. So it's more crammed, less information, but it generally has a black background, and it's formatted to print. And all you do is print this sheet out, And you can print it on pretty much anything, but what I recommend is just some vinyl sheets, adhesive vinyl sheets, easily obtained, and you get a printout like this. And then what you can do is you just go in with either a simple like rotary paper cutter or scissors or a straight edge and an X-Acto knife, and you just cut out a strip. So the way it works is each one of those rows in the spreadsheet is already formatted to be the correct size when printed out to fit right on your spacer. And all you do is just peel it and adhere it on there, and you're good to go on one of the long sides. Now, you can actually use, because focus spacers are the same across different lenses. They're just numbered 1 through 14. And so what you can actually do is have 2 lenses listed, or 2 labels for any given spacer, right? You can have here an 80 millimeter on one side, flip it, have a 65 millimeter on the other side, right? And which side should be facing up, facing you on the camera is, that's the one that will, you know, that depending on which lens you have mounted. You flip it either way and just make sure that this matches the actual lens that you have mounted on the camera, and you're good to go. To actually shoot this camera, it's very, very simple. The basic operation is you need to make sure you switch it on. So you switch the top switch to on, and once you set up your shot, however that is, you need to make sure you cock your shutters. Whatever film back you're shooting with, you need to make sure you either have taken your dark slide out, you open your dark slide, or maybe you've just taped up and are not using a dark slide. But you need to make sure your film is exposable, and then you just press the button, and that's it. But I'm going to now talk about 2 different modes of shooting. One is to shoot on a tripod, and one is handheld shooting. So the different considerations of the camera for both of those modes. For tripod shooting, basically, first thing you need to know is that the bottom of the camera contains a QR foot. Now, this is the Arca Swiss system, and any Arca Swiss QR style tripod clamp like this, and these are generic. This is cost, you know, very, very inexpensive, and this can be mounted to any tripod. This is what you want. You want some kind of QR clamp, and a QR clamp, the camera slides right on the clamp and you just tighten it up. That's the best way to mount it. It's the most secure and stable way to mount this camera on a tripod. Again, it can be any tripod, you get yourself a QR foot. Now, if for some reason you want to use some other tripod plate without adding a QR foot to it, you can do that. There's also a standard 1/4-20 mounting point for other tripod plates, but I highly recommend that you use a QR foot when shooting with a tripod. Now, of course, you can shoot on a tripod with a viewfinder instantaneously if you want. But one of the great advantages of shooting on a tripod, and an absolute advantage of the Stereo 12 camera, is that it acts like a large format camera and gives you the ability to mount a ground glass back. There are 3 types of ground glass back available for the Stereo 12. The first is just a basic back, and this allows you to preview your image. It's inexpensive, it's easy. Second type is called the deluxe ground glass back, and this has an actual ridge on the back, so it slots into your camera. It not only locks by the graph lock sliders like the basic one, but it's more stable. And it also has, it's the same glass, so same image you'll see, but it has these accessory rails. And the rails allow you to mount objects like this, for instance. Oh, these are These are adjustable so that you can loosen them up to add accessories, and you can tighten those accessories on there if you want. So this is a protective cap that basically when you're traveling, etc., completely protects your glass. There's also a sun hood. This basically allows you to view your images outside in bright sunlight without washing out the ground glass. Both of those accessories come with the deluxe ground glass back. Another accessory that's available separately is the magnifier, and so this actually slides on, and you can view either your right eye or left eye at one at a time, and it magnifies, and it completely blocks the light so that you can be in complete sunlight and still perfectly see your image, to double check your framing for each side, your focus, your etc. So this slides to either side, and it can also slide to the edge so that when you want to look at your full image without removing this from the back. Very, very handy. Finally, there's the deluxe super bright back. And this functionally acts just like a deluxe back. It has the same rails, takes the same accessories, etc. But the standard ground glass in it has been replaced with a special custom cut optical high-end glass that provides a almost 2 stops brighter image, and it gives you etched grid lines, etc. So it's for those, if you want a brighter image, because it has a built-in Fresnel lens. It's brand new, more advanced than old style ground glass. To shoot with ground glass, you mount the glass on the back of your camera instead of a film back, and then you need to put your shutters into aperture preview mode. Now that's different for different models of shutters. So for Copals, for instance, all you have to do is flick this little aperture lever, preview lever, and when you put it to the open mode, what it does is it just opens up your lenses, and generally you also then need to set your aperture to the absolute widest aperture possible. Open up all the way because you want to maximize the light hitting your ground glass so you see a bright image. Most shutters have some kind of aperture preview, but some do not, including the Mamiya TLR shutters, which are very popular on the Stereo 12. So because those don't have a preview, when you're using them with ground glass, we have built in a special preview method here. And it uses these little screws. And these screws are normally, can be kept in the back of underneath of the lens board. There's a little threaded place to hold them, so they're not always out. Basically, because you don't want to lose these, but you would insert them in these little threads here when you're ready to shoot with ground glass. And the way you do this is you have to set the shutters to B mode, to bulb mode. So that's the B. And of course, make sure your aperture is all the way open. These are very fast lenses, so they work well with ground glass. You have to preview them like this. And then what you do is you cock the shutters, and you can trip them either, if it's on the camera, you can trip it with the trigger, or you can do this manually, and you can just press the piston in. But when you do this, either way you do this, you have to hold it in. So you press it in, you see the lens has opened, but I'm holding it, I'm not letting it go back. And then I just screw in this little screw just a little bit. You're not trying to create any pressure there, you're just enough that it holds the piston open. So see, now I let go and it stays open. And I'm going to do the same to this side. Basically, the lens board itself offers the aperture preview mode that the shutters lack. So either way, whether it's like this, and then when you're done with your ground glass, you just loosen it a little bit, and you're back to shooting normally. But either way, once you've got your lenses in aperture preview mode, your f-stop wide open and your ground glass back in place, you will see exactly the image that will be exposed on your film. And remember, no viewfinder, on no stereo camera do you see an accurate image if you're not using ground glass, because a viewfinder or even a waist level finder or whatever will only show you an average between your two lenses. And what you really want to know, if you're shooting precisely, is the exact framing of each of those two lenses. And you can only get that through ground glass. And if you look here, you can see the exact edges of your frame for both the left and right side. You can also preview your focus, make sure that you got it right, that everything that you wanted to be within your focal zone is in fact in focus. And of course, you can just preview your image, and by comparing the left and right images, you can actually tell for any given subject at any given distance how much stereo depth it will have by how divergent it is, how different of a position it lands in on the left versus the right frame. So you're actually previewing your depth here, how strong the 3D effect will be. Once you're happy with your image, take your lenses out of aperture preview mode, set the f-stop and shutter speed that you've metered for, replace your ground glass back with your film back, pull your dark slide, and expose your shot. Now, perhaps the more usual way of shooting the Stereo 12 is, of course, handheld. As you've already seen with focal spacers and focal zones, this camera is extremely fast and easy to shoot handheld compared to cameras that have helical focus, which people get lulled into trying to focus on their subjects instead of focusing on their focal zones for stereo, and they're often off if you need to shoot really quickly, etc. That's not a problem here. So shooting handheld is really pleasurable on this camera, but you'll need a viewfinder because that's how you'll view your image. So MercuryWorks has a couple of viewfinders. This is our optical deluxe 55mm, 65mm viewfinder. This has bright lines in it, a bright line frame, and it's very bright and gives you a very large image. And this just slides on your cold shoe when you're viewing the through the bright lines, the guides that are etched in and back illuminated in the finder. That's a 65mm frame. When the larger image outside of the bright lines is a 55mm frame, and even a 50mm or 47mm lens, you can pretty much approximate and use this, just assuming you know that you have a bit more image on the edges. So that's a pretty standard and straightforward viewfinder. There's also a non-optical viewfinder for a normal lenses. So this is for 75mm lenses up to 105mm lenses. And the way it works is it has a little frame that snaps on the front of it, and that basically acts as a mask. And you could also create your own mask here, but you can swap that out to mask down to different frames. That's the 105mm one, for instance. And that, of course, just like has a nice rubber eye cup, and it's designed specifically engineered for the square format. So this is a great viewfinder for any lens in the 75mm to 100mm range. Now, the other thing you might want to do when shooting handheld is to attach a side handle. And as I mentioned before, this is a small rig standard attachment port for side handles. In the user guide, we have a couple of recommended side handles. This is a very simple one from Newer, and it's very small, light, and works really well. And you just mount it right there. There are other ones by Small Rig, and basically what you do is you just screw them in. And once you've done that, you have a full side handle to complement the right-hand side. So the right-hand side has your trigger, but left-hand side not only allows you to grip with both sides, but it also allows you to hold the camera while you are swapping backs easily, and especially while you are pulling a dark slide or returning a dark slide. Now, when you're shooting handheld for a long time, I do recommend that you actually remove the dark slide and tape up the dark slide slot with a bit of a strip of gaffer's tape, like this. And that prevents light from leaking in the dark slide port on your back. And that's true of all backs, old backs, new backs, etc. You're always safer if you tape them up. And that's something you can do if you're just going to be walking around with a setup for a while. Just put a little tiny piece of tape, gaffer's tape. You don't want something that would leave residue, but gaffer's tape on the edge of your back. But nonetheless, if you are using a dark slide or operating anything else, holding it with the left hand and allowing you to operate with the right is really useful. So I highly recommend using a side handle. Now, there's one very special type of side handle that I particularly recommend, and this is called a quick release NATO side handle. In order to use it on the Stereo 12, you have to add something called a NATO rail, and that's this little metal piece right here. This is also made by Small Rig. It mounts in the same spot that handles would directly mount, except that you need a special kit to mount this. And it amounts to a replacement side shoe here that it basically conforms to this NATO rail. And also there's a little spacer that goes under the NATO rail to raise it up so it doesn't get in the way of or interfere with this Lensboard port. So you need that kit, just a tiny little inexpensive kit, those two parts, and if you use those parts, you can mount this mini NATO rail by Small Rig. And once you have that rail mounted, you can attach this quick release handle, and it goes on there and you just press it in place, and it automatically snaps in place, and you have a rail. It's a side handle connected to your rail. It's really incredibly fast. And on the front, to release it, you just pull that and it pops right off. So it's faster. The side handles are already pretty fast to just screw on or off, but this is sort of the deluxe Cadillac version where it's so easy instantly to snap it in place and to remove it that I particularly recommend it. It's a bit more expensive, but really worth it if you're going to shoot a lot of handheld photography with this camera. And that covers all the basic operations of the camera. For advanced options and all of the different possibilities and attachments and accessories and all the things you can do with this camera, of course, read the full user guide. Last reminder, when you're done shooting, you're not going to shoot for a while, make sure you switch the camera off. That's what preserves the batteries. On a normal set of good alkaline 9-volt batteries, you should be able to get somewhere between 60 and 100 exposures. Generally, that lasts me, 6 months to a year. But the key is not to leave this on for large periods of time. Even if you leave it on for a day, it'll only drain your batteries a little bit. But nonetheless, if you leave it on for a week, you'll really be doing serious drainage on those batteries. So switch it off when not using it. I hope this was helpful. Go out there and shoot some beautiful 3D images.